Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to pause here for 5 seconds and then I'll tell you why. All right, I just want to note something. I did that because I want to note that our federal government just spent $1 million. In 5 seconds, $1 million. By the time I finish this speech, the government will have spent over $50 million. By the time my colleagues finish their speeches, that figure will be in the hundreds of millions. As it stands right now, our government is spending $197,000 per second, which, as a recent publication by the America First Policy Institute points out, is faster than the speed of light. Let's look at this graphic here real quick. I'll put it up. Just ran this off on the copy machine, staff did, because I wanted to blow it up. This is a post by AFPI. And they point out the fastest things on the earth. And they note that we're actually spending right now faster than the speed of light. The speed of light is 186,282 miles per second. We're spending $197,000 a second. Our national debt is well over $31 trillion right now, $31 trillion. Now listen, if those figures alarm you, you are not alone. Everybody on our side of the aisle is deeply concerned about this. We understand what a risk it is to our national security, to the stability of our constitutional republic. But you won't find anyone, hardly anyone, I think, on the other side of the aisle that understands this or agrees with it. I mean, based upon their voting records, based upon their proposals to continue to raise taxes and raise spending, based upon some of the speeches they gave here on the floor tonight, they don't get it. And neither does the mainstream media. And that ought to be of even greater concern to you. So earlier this month, the Congressional Budget Office released a frightening report. And we all members of Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, met in the Congressional Auditorium this afternoon to hear the CBO director relay some of this really frightening information. It's about our economic outlook. If you haven't heard about it yet, it's because really the media is not covering this. The 24-hour news cycle buries it for the next big thing. But there's hardly anything bigger than this. Let me give you a couple of the highlights that came out of that briefing this afternoon. Number one, net interest on our national debt will reach $10.5 trillion over the next decade. Now, I know these numbers are big and it's hard to grasp them, but you think about $10.5 trillion over the next 10 years. For reference, listen to this. Since 1940, the total net interest payments on our national debt has been $12.9 trillion, adjusted for inflation. Since 1940. And so in the next 10 years, we're going to spend $10.5 trillion just on interest alone. It's staggering. Our national debt is going to reach $154 trillion by 2053. $150+ trillion. That equals $540,000 per household when you adjust for inflation. That is more than 4 times the current median household income. Deficits are going to average $2 trillion annually, or 6.1% of our gross domestic product over the next 10 years. The government had a lower deficit than this every single year from 1945 to 2009. The cost of the annual interest will balloon from $350 billion to $1.4 trillion in just a decade. That is 20 cents of every tax dollar that is collected by this federal government is going to go to paying interest on America's debt. Mr. Speaker, we're in uncharted economic waters. We've never seen anything like this. Our country has only faced an economic threat like this during times of war and pandemic. And if you only listen to the media and Democrat politicians, all of our colleagues over here, you would think there's really no issue at all. I mean, the Biden administration continues to portray this rosy outlook. I mean, they were saying it today. The state of the economy is, this is not so bad. We're doing well. We're trending in the right direction, they say. It's absolutely not true. The CBO, by the way, is a nonpartisan entity. They don't choose a side. They just came in and presented the objective facts to Republicans and Democrats because we want to make everybody face this harsh reality. President Biden has touted that his administration, quote, cut $1.7 trillion of the deficit. And he says that's evidence that, he's really serious about the national debt. But that is obviously fiction as well. That reduction naturally occurred with the statutory end of the increased spending that Congress approved to combat COVID-19. That wasn't because of any shrewd economic policy from the White House. It's exactly the opposite. Speaking of economic madness, tomorrow the president is expected to release his 2023 budget proposal. It's more than a month late. Every news report, all the early ones, suggest that his budget is replete with trillions of dollars in new taxes, raising taxes in the middle of an inflation crisis that he created. More spending on frivolous, liberal pet policies and projects, and no plan at all to reduce the deficit. But for the first time in his presidency, he won't have a Democrat rubber stamp over here. He won't have the Democrats in charge of this House to go along with that destructive agenda. Mr. Speaker, the American people made their voices heard when they gave Republicans control of this House, and we are going to do our job. They've entrusted our new majority to provide a much-needed check on the Biden administration, and that starts with the power of the purse. Over the next few months, the discourse around here is going to intensify. This is going to be some heated debate. It's likely to get off track with squabbles about everything from defense spending to earmarks, but House Republicans will not lose sight through this of the bigger picture. We are going to rein in spending and inflation because we must. We're going to promote responsible budgeting because we must. We're going to chart our country on a course back to fiscal sanity. And it is the duty of every member of this body to do so. Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to yield to a number of my colleagues tonight who will participate in the special order hour, talking about lots of important things on the hearts and minds of the American people, but I just want to suggest that the debt is one of those. Mr. Speaker, I would yield first to the gentlelady, my dear friend from the state of Illinois, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, is this on? Thank you, Congressman Johnson, for hosting this special order. The American agriculture industry powers our economy and feeds the world, but President Biden wants to burden farmers and landowners with higher taxes and more red tape with his disastrous Waters of the United States rule. Farmers and ranchers do not want to be told how to use and regulate their land by Biden's radical cabinet secretaries. I introduced a bill called Define WOTUS Act with Senator Braun to protect my fellow farmers and stand against the disastrous Biden EPA, which is working to regulate every pond and puddle in America. Our nation's farmers, ranchers, and property owners come last in the Biden agenda. This week, I will proudly stand with House Republicans to pass legislation ending Biden's disastrous WOTUS rule. We are going to put American farmers first. It's my privilege to advocate for my fellow Illinois farmers on the House Agriculture Committee and represent our needs in Congress. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady for highlighting that really important issue. The WOTUS rule has gotten completely out of control. Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to yield next to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Desposito, one of our new members to the Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to announce that radical criminal justice legislation passed by the Washington, D.C. City Council appears to be headed for defeat thanks to widespread rejection by House Republicans. The legislation in question, known as the Revised Criminal Code Act of 2022, eliminates mandatory minimum sentences for a long list of crimes, while also reducing maximum sentences for things like first-degree burglary, armed burglary, and first-degree sexual assault. This law, being advanced by the far-left D.C. local politicians, handcuffs the courts and empowers convicted criminals to get back out on the streets in record time. Not only is this legislation misguided, but it comes at the height of a crime wave currently ravishing Capitol Hill. Over the last year, our nation's capital has seen a 76% increase in carjackings, a 17% increase in homicides, and a 117% uptick in sexual assaults. To fight this scourge, we need to be taking a harder line on criminals, not coddling them like this justice reform package would do. When the RCCA came before the House of Representatives for congressional review, House Republicans stood united in our opposition to this proposal. I'm glad 31 of our Democratic colleagues did the right thing for the people of Washington, D.C., and crossed the aisle to stand with the Republican conference in opposing the bill. Now it appears a bipartisan group from the Senate will be joining myself and our House colleagues to defeat the RCCA, with President Biden also poised to lend his support. Safeguarding our streets should never be a partisan issue, and common sense must always remain at the forefront of legislators' minds. I am glad such common sense seems to be winning the day in this case. During my career as an NYPD detective, I served alongside law enforcement professionals of differing political persuasions, religions, and cultural backgrounds. And let me remind everyone that when those that call 911, we never ask what political party they are from. What united us as cops was our commitment to serving the people and protecting the public from criminals. Now, as a member of Congress, I will continue that service by combating far-left attacks on our criminal justice system and forcefully reject radical legislation, much like the RCCA and the criminal justice reform put in place by Democrats in my home state of New York. I will always advocate for safe streets and prosperous communities. That is my pledge to you, and that is our House Republican commitment to America. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for that service as a police officer, law enforcement, and also now in Congress. We're delighted to have you in that perspective. Mr. Speaker, I am happy to yield next the gentleman from California, Mr. Lamothe.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson from Louisiana, for leading these opportunities for us to communicate with the American people openly and freely in a more casual, non-hurried way of doing so. So it's good to be able to talk about these issues, and hopefully folks are paying attention. We're just trying to get the truth out and call out the issues that are extremely important to them. We're working on in Congress. When I get up here, a lot of times I'm talking about our food supply. The farmers that grow it. As a Californian, we grow a lot of different crops. The water it takes to grow those crops, our energy, the condition of our energy in this country. But tonight, I want to talk more so about our fiscal condition in this nation and of this government. So it's troubling because, a recent report issued by the Congressional Budget Office found that the net interest of our national debt, and Mr. Johnson was talking about that a little bit ago on the spending, that interest, just the interest payment on our national debt, will amount to $10.5 trillion, that kind of burden for our taxpayers over the next decade. And we talk of these 10-year numbers, so you average that out, that's $1.05 trillion per year, just in interest service. For comparison, those interest costs over the previous decade amount to only $3 trillion, again, versus $10.5 trillion for the coming decade. That's crushing. That's crushing on our national budget and crushing on the discretionary portion that we have over that budget. And that's not to take away from the fact that the federal government already is taxing and extracts more in taxes from American families than at any point in history. So this kind of payment on interest will devour a lot of our budget if we don't get a handle on this. I shudder if interest rates go up much more and the service on that debt becomes that much more extensive. Of course, federal spending is coupled with that. It's rising at an even higher rate. The increased spending has pushed our national debt over that magic $31 trillion number again we were speaking about. As high as this is, it pales in comparison to the United States' unfunded liabilities. The unfunded liabilities, which amount to about $182 trillion. Unfunded liabilities, meaning the debt obligations that do not have sufficient funds set aside to pay them, include Social Security, Medicare, federal debt held by the public, and federal employee and veteran benefits. Social Security and Medicare's liabilities add up to $57 trillion. These numbers clearly show the United States federal government is living beyond its means. The entitlement programs known as Social Security and Medicare, let me stop on that for a moment. Entitlement programs, sometimes that word entitlement is thought of as a dirty word, right? And it gets used pretty freely around here. But when you're talking about the entitlement as applied to Social Security and Medicare, it's not necessarily a dirty word because the people that paid into them are entitled to draw out from them. So that's not a bad word in that sense. They're entitled to what they paid in and the amount that it grew during the time, hopefully, while it was being held for them more or less in trust by the federal government. So those programs, Social Security and Medicare, are predicted by the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, to run out of money in 2033, that's Social Security, and 2026 for Medicare, respectively. The fund will be depleted. So when we have a conversation, and we need to have an honest conversation about these funds, about these programs, going forward. No one wants to take away Social Security. Nobody wants to deplete Medicare. But if they're going to be on the rocks in the year 2033 for Social Security, for example, then we better be doing something now. And it needs to be an honest bipartisan discussion in doing so. What are we going to do to head that off and have the numbers not crunch badly by the time that time comes? There's ways we can do that, but it's going to take an honest bipartisan, not scaring people thinking, oh, the Republicans are going to take away the Social Security. The president stood right up there and tried to claim that until he had to walk it back just a few weeks ago. It needs to be an honest discussion, not one used as a talking point or a political weapon. So what we have is 47 million retirees in America today, and 40% of the 47 million live entirely off Social Security. For these Americans, their benefits being reduced in the future could be disastrous. That's why we have to figure out how to make the fund go beyond 2033 and be sustainable, well, permanently. So if we're going to save these programs for the current and future generations, Congress must act swiftly, honestly, with a real debate, to set these finances in order and return to the fiscal responsibility we should have had all along. As stewards of the public's dollars, it's important that Congress spend the public's money wisely and respectfully. The House must use its powers to allocate government funds in a reasonable, responsible way. A lot of room for debate on how that is, but if we're having an interaction instead of hurrying through or doing a last-minute patch-up at the end of the fiscal year, it's going to be a lot better off in the light of day doing so. The current D.C. model of taxing, borrowing, and spending money that we don't have will saddle our grandchildren with the burden of paying off today's debts. We don't even have to wait for their grandchildren. It's our children. It's us that are still in the work world. We're stuck with this. We have to do better. Failure to fix Washington, D.C. spending today will mean our children will have to live at lesser standards. We've always aspired that our children should always do a little better than us, to leave something a little better off. Why should they have to live under a worse standard? Only because we're spending like crazy. They'll be saddled with a higher debt, higher taxes, and less opportunity. America's strength on the world stage depends on a strong American economy at home. We must get to getting it actually balanced and not take so long to truly balancing our budget. It's our responsibility. Thank you for the time, sir. I yield back.
Thank you for that wise counsel. It's about responsibility, and I think you said it so well, my friend. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield next to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Louisiana for organizing this evening. He's a brilliant orator and brilliant lawyer, and proud to serve with him. If I can, Mr. Speaker, tonight I want to speak about one of the biggest challenges facing our country today, and that's our national debt. We've heard about it tonight. Our national debt today stands at over $31 trillion. It's really hard to comprehend a number that large, even for us who serve in the House of Representatives. Instead of taking advantage of the record tax revenues that were produced from the Republican-passed Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, Democrats have used the 2 prior years that they had in power, when they had the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, to spend an unprecedented amount of taxpayer dollars. Here are 2 big Democratic initiatives. Almost $2 trillion spent on the American Rescue Plan. Almost $750 billion spent on what they call the Inflation Reduction Act, really the Inflation Expansion Act. Here's the bottom line. The result of the massive and colossal spending over those past 2 years has produced skyrocketing debt and rapid and raging inflation. We all hear about that inflation each and every day. Just the fact that Americans have a tough time affording to live and exist today. Right now, our country is on track to add almost $20 trillion to the national debt over the next decade. We've heard these numbers quite a bit tonight. I don't think the American people can hear it enough. By 2053, that number will reach almost $153 to $154 trillion, trillion with a T. The interest cost on our national debt, it'll amount to almost $10.5 trillion for taxpayers over the next decade. Now, again, to put that in perspective, the net interest cost over the previous 10 years was a little over $3 trillion. Almost a month ago, our government officially hit its debt limit, and the Treasury Department is now using extraordinary measures to postpone a default. Every household, every business, frankly, everybody must balance their budget in order to survive. The federal government should be no exception. The bottom line is something's got to change because Americans are getting crushed under the weight of President Biden's failed economic policies. The good news is that House Republicans are committed to turning this around for American families, for American businesses, for the American people. Just this week, I traveled to Yukon, Oklahoma, with my colleagues on the House Ways and Means Committee to hear about the economic and regulatory challenges that they face each and every day. It's the second field hearing that the committee has held since taking back the House of Representatives. In February, we traveled to West Virginia to hear from people in Appalachia. Republicans on the House Committee on Ways and Means are determined to hear directly from taxpayers, from business owners, from farmers, from manufacturers, from energy producers about how we can ensure that we can get past all the hardships and all the hurdles. We want to ensure that everyone can succeed. The message that we've heard as a committee from the American people, it's been very clear. Americans have had enough. In our commitment to America, House Republicans promise to work towards creating an economy that is strong. And one of the most effective ways that we can do that is to rein in the out-of-control spending and get our government's fiscal house in order. We've got to find sensible, reasonable, and responsible solutions to addressing our nation's economic and debt crisis. As it stands now, we're leaving our children, our grandchildren, and the next generation with the bill and forcing them to live with potentially higher taxes and less opportunities unless we can do something and do something now. So from all of us on this side of the aisle, we want to make sure that Congress can come together, that we get our country's finances in order so that the promise of the American dream stays intact for families in my home state of Tennessee, in my district, and certainly across the nation. We can do it. We've got to work hard, but we've got to rein in this out-of-control spending. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you, Congressman Johnson, for organizing tonight so that we can speak directly to the American people about this crucial issue. And with that, I yield back my time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, my friend. That was so well said, and great orator yourself, and I love how you laid out the case methodically. That's what a former U.S. attorney from the Western District of Tennessee would do, so thank you for that.
We all try. Thank you, sir.
Facts are stubborn things, as John Adams said. Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to yield next to another brilliant lawyer, this one from the state of Virginia, my good friend, Mr. Klein.
I thank the gentleman from Louisiana for yielding. And it's true, the wasteful spending, the tax hikes, and the excessive regulations of the Biden administration are crushing working families, small businesses across this country. In particular, I want to rise tonight in support of the House Joint Resolution to denounce Biden's overly ambitious rule proposed for changing the definition of the waters of the United States, also known as WOTUS. You know, agriculture is the #1 industry in Virginia, and the 6th District is proud to be home to more than 8,000 farms. Narrowly defined water regulation is key to ensure that Virginia's agriculture industry can succeed and local industries can thrive. Unfortunately, the disastrous EPA is working to regulate every pond and every puddle, every stream and small creek with their new WOTUS regulation. This new rule is going to negatively impact the vital goods and services that farmers and ranchers and small businesses provide to the Commonwealth and across the nation. I've heard from farmers and property owners up and down my district. One thing is clear: they do not want to be told how to use and regulate their land by Joe Biden's radical EPA. Imposing this overly broad and burdensome regulation will grant Biden's bureaucrats more arbitrary control over our rural communities, saddling folks with costly red tape. It's far past time that we rescind the administration's new WOTUS ruling and protect America's farmers from this gross overreach of government power. I want to thank the gentleman again for organizing this evening's event, and I yield back.
Thank you, my friend. The regulatory environment is just out of control, and that recent Supreme Court opinion of the EPA versus West Virginia came out on our side, and I think that some of these agencies will begin to have their wings clipped a bit, and hopefully this WOTUS rule will be handled appropriately. Thank you for highlighting that really important issue. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield next to one of the new stars of the Republican Party here in the Congress, a gentleman from Oklahoma, former state senator there, and now represents the 2nd District, representing his people very well. Mr. Breach.
Thank you very much to the Congressman from Louisiana. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't stand for a more important topic, and this is what I believe is the greatest domestic threat that's facing this country. Our national debt and our last 40 years of inheriting prosperity from our parents and our grandparents, and in the last many years we have been borrowing and stealing prosperity from our children and our grandchildren because of an insatiable appetite for spending other people's money, with the easiest thing to do, in a manner that's not in line with our revenue. And there's a founding father who gave us a great warning. Thomas Jefferson told us, he said, you should not allow your leaders to load you with perpetual debt. It's the same Thomas Jefferson who years later would make the comment, he would talk about what he defined in Latin terms as the abusive state of man. And he said, the forehorse of this frightful team is public debt. Taxation follows that, and in its train is wretchedness and oppression. Our liberty as a nation is in jeopardy. We hear trillions of dollars that are, tossed around, and I don't think we really understand the size and scope of $1 trillion. If I stood on this floor and at a second at a time I laid a dollar bill on this podium and I didn't stop to eat or sleep, taking a second at a time to lay out that dollar bill, it would take me 11 days. You'd get tired sitting in that chair, Mr. Speaker, 11 days watching me count out $1 million. If I was to lay out a dollar at a time on this table, a second at a time, the time to lay it out and retrieve my hand, it would take me 31 years to lay out $1 billion if I didn't stop to eat or sleep. In order to get to $1 trillion, it would take me 31,000 years. 31,000 years if I didn't stop to eat or sleep a second at a time. We know what has happened in 2022, 40-year high record of inflation. The average Oklahoman spent $7,000 more than they did the year prior to buy the exact same goods and services because of devaluation of the dollar. That's the tip of the iceberg. That's what we see. That's what people are feeling. But what's under the water that we can't see is this collision course that we're headed towards. This gigantic iceberg of the mountain of debt and our unfunded obligations. Our national debt at $31.5 trillion. Every man, woman, and newborn child, if you take that number and you divide it, every baby, including babies, that open their eyes today and take in their first breath of air owe $94,000 just to pay off that $94,000. They will pay it off through a lower standard of living. It's a hidden tax that we're going to pass on to our kids because of our selfishness. $1.4 trillion has been a number that's kind of been in my head for the last few days. The CBO number, the Congressional Budget Office number, said that this year's deficit's $1.4 trillion. We will overspend $1.4 trillion this year. If you go back 40 years ago to 1983, that's exactly the size of our gross national debt in 1983, was $1.4 trillion. It took us 200 years as a nation to get to $1.4 trillion, and this year we will overspend in 1 year that amount. CBO also giving us projections about where our interest rates are taking us. Within 7 years, what we spend, what we flush down the toilet just in interest payments, is going to match what we spend on our entire defense of our country. But if you take that interest payment out to 10 years from now, it's also $1.4 trillion. So there's the number yet again. In 1983, our size after 200 years, $1.4 trillion, our gross national debt. This year, we'll overspend by that amount, our annual deficit. In 10 years from now, that will be just the interest that was flushed down the toilet, annual debt service payments, 10 years from now. That's a 50-year spread of $1.4 trillion. We're in trouble. Our current debt to GDP ratio, gross national debt to GDP ratio, is 129%. There's only 11 other countries in the world that have a higher debt to GDP ratio than we do. And these are the small countries. The small countries that aren't a world leader, a shining city on a hill. Economists are predicting that Medicare will be insolvent in 2028. They've actually bumped the number to 2028. It's when we were only going to be able to pay out to 90%. To 90%. It'll be an automatic 10% cut in 2028 to Medicare if we do nothing. In 2033, the actuaries are telling us on Social Security that it becomes insolvent. There'll be an automatic 25% cut to Social Security. Without anyone changing anything, that's what we face. When you add the liabilities, the unfunded liabilities of Medicare, Social Security, what we owe veterans for pensions, federal employees for pensions, other trust programs we've stolen out of over the last many years, and you add it in addition to our $31 trillion, our sum total is $120 trillion of unfunded liabilities / debt. That came out last year with very little fanfare. Only the Heartland Institute picked it up. That $120 trillion total, they said if you put it against all assets in America, if you assessed it against the valuation of all property, all land, all homes, all stocks, and they even said this, down to pieces of furniture, It's 86% of all wealth in America right now. So you remember I talked through how long it would take to get to $1 trillion. It would take you 31,000 years if you counted out a dollar at a time. It would take you to get to 120 trillion, 3.7 million years to count out a dollar at a time to get to $120 trillion. If you didn't stop to eat or sleep and you counted out a dollar at a time. According to the U.S. Treasury Department, in its February 2022 report that I just cited, in order for us to pay this all back, another way of looking at it, if every household would just send $1 million check to your federal government, that will make us square with the House as a nation. Thomas Jefferson wasn't alone. Benjamin Franklin, he warned us, if we can gather it, from his conversation to Elizabeth Powell and when this Constitution was put together. And when he was asked outside by Elizabeth Powell as one of the leading members of the Philadelphia Society after weeks of putting this Constitution together, she said, "What have you given us, a republic or a monarch?" And his response was, "We've given you a republic if you can keep it." And that's important because Article 4, Section 4 of our U.S. Constitution guarantees to every state a republican form of government and to protect them against invasion. But we'll stay on the Republican conversation, the republic form, for a moment. Why is a republic important? Our founders in that study in the Constitutional Convention, they looked at all forms of government. They spent weeks. And a republic was different, and they knew it, than a democracy. Benjamin Franklin also described democracy. He said it's two wolves and a lamb voting on what they're going to have for lunch. But liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. And what we're talking about is the liberty of this country. We are trading our liberty for debt and dependency. Liberty means something. In the constitutional preamble, it says that we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, ensure domestic tranquility, establish justice, all the elements. But the last one, secure the blessing of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Secure the blessing of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. It's a mission statement. And we have a duty to live up to the mission statement that was handed to us 200 years ago, and we're missing the mark. May God help us obtain the courage to put our national interest ahead of our own personal self-interest and squarely face these problems that are addressing the American people. And I'll end by saying this. Martin Luther King Jr. had a statement that my old boss, Tom Coburn, kind of tweaked, and he shortened it. And it's this. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? It is right to secure the blessing of liberty, not just for ourselves, but our posterity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, my friend. It's a harsh truth, and we have to address it. And you're right, as you implied there, the inevitable result of living beyond our means today is that we and our children inevitably are going to have to live below our means tomorrow. We're going to have higher debt, we're going to have higher taxes, less security, less opportunity. It's not going to be the same America that we've always known and valued. It's a harsh truth. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield next to a gentleman from Wisconsin, my good friend, Mr. Grothman.
Well, I know normally this hour is taken up with speeches that I think are not bipartisan enough. And I've decided to take this time to congratulate President Biden on his decision not to veto the bill we are sending over to him, which will prevent the District of Columbia from decreasing the penalties for severe crimes committed in this city. I think what President Biden has done is he finally recognized what a lot of us have been saying over the last few years. The District of Columbia is just plainly and simply not capable of self-governance at this time. I'm glad President Biden agrees with us on that topic. Right now, the District of Columbia has the second highest spending per capita in the country on its schools, trailing only New York. Nevertheless, its test scores are abysmal. The over 200 murders last year in the nation's capital is also an embarrassment, and that number has skyrocketed this year so far as of mid-February. I'll tell you, this is the nation's capital. There's no city we should care about more than the District of Columbia. It should be a shining light to represent the United States. People come here from all around the world. I remember once I took a trip to Taipei, the large capital city of Taiwan, and I was there with some friends, and I asked our tour guide, is there anywhere at night we should not go, expecting there were some places we could not walk to without danger. We were told there's nowhere in Taipei we can't go. Nowhere? Nowhere in Taipei is not safe. And I was kind of embarrassed about my country because I thought, well, I was safe going to Taipei. If I had visitors coming from Taiwan to Washington, D.C., I would be talking for quite a while explaining all the places we couldn't go here. I don't know whether people are aware of Vladimir Putin makes fun of our country for allowing such decline in the District of Columbia. Not only how embarrassingly high our crime rate is, but how embarrassing low our test scores in the schools are, how embarrassing it is to have so many homeless people wherever you look. So I hope President Biden builds on this new conversion in which he is admitting the District of Columbia is not capable, apparently, of setting appropriate punishments for crimes here. I look forward to working with President Biden on perhaps things we can do to improve the decisions by the local school board on their schools, maybe make some changes in their welfare policies that lead to so many homeless people here. But in any event, like I said, I'd like to end tonight's speeches on an upbeat message, thanking President Biden for his conversion to the understanding that the people here in the District of Columbia, who, by the way, he's not a perfect man, but they voted 6% for Donald Trump in the last election. I kind of wondered, what type of people would do that, but they did. But in any event, hopefully President Biden would be happy to meet with us and think of other things we can do to improve the life in our nation's capital. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman, and I'd just point out, as you said, that our resolution blocking those crazy changes to D.C.'s criminal code was so strong that even Joe Biden couldn't agree to veto it. So we're doing the right thing. We must continue, and we will. I'm grateful to my Republican colleagues for joining me for this special order hour. And with nothing further, Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.